Hi guys, this is one that's been recommended by several people, including Grendel4503, Christopher P. Moreland, SB, Michael, and Sean2KK8. I think there are more people who recommended it, so please step forward to get the thanks you deserve. This is a very heavy case, which I'll split into two, part 1 today, part 2 the middle of next week, and I'll upload the full thing at some point. These videos will be demonetised without a doubt, and this means they may disappear into the void, so if I could ask you guys to watch them, so at least it has some hope of latching onto the mysterious algorithm, I'd appreciate it. Much of the information in this video is taken from the book The Shankill Butchers, a case study of mass murder by Martin Dillon, the definitive text on this case. Also, I'll use a few clips from the 1998 film The Resurrection Man, starring Stuart Townsend as Victor Kelly, a character based on Lenny Murphy, the monster at the centre of this case. Anyway, on with the video. The Troubles was the name given to a roughly 30-year period in Northern Ireland, where rival factions engaged in a guerrilla campaign of violence, apparently fighting for the future of the Irish people. Bombings and tit-for-tat killings were commonplace, and walking the streets past heavily armed soldiers and armoured vehicles was a part of daily life. But between 1975 and 1982 in Belfast, it wasn't the sound of bullets or explosions that people needed to fear. It was the sound of a London black taxi, the mode of transport used by a group of depraved, psychopathic sadists known as the Shankill Butchers, led by a monster called Lenny Murphy, who murdered at least 22 people, dragging many off the streets at random before subjecting them to horrific acts of torture and mutilation before dumping their bodies in the street. This group were the most prolific gang of serial killers in UK history. Welcome to Evil Among Us. For this video, I need to provide context. I'm going to give a very brief overview of a terrible period of history, the victims of which should never be forgotten. I'll leave links to some good videos specifically focused on the period known as the Troubles below. Please, if you're not interested in this section and just want to get to the perpetrators and their crimes, then skip ahead. So essentially, for approximately 30 years, from the 1960s until the 1990s, an armed conflict occurred in Northern Ireland, a country under British rule. One side was apparently fighting to reunify Ireland, making the North part of the Republic of Ireland in the South, and these were known as Republicans, and the group most associated with this side of the conflict is the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA, but this is an umbrella term. There were various factions and splinter cells, including, relevant to the time period of this video, in the 1970s and early 80s, the Provisional IRA, which split from the official IRA at the end of the 1960s. There were further groups which later emerged, including the Continuity IRA and the Real IRA, because the other guys were just fucking about apparently. On the other side were those who supposedly fought to keep Northern Ireland under British rule. These were known as Loyalists, and the most prominent paramilitary organisations were the Ulster Defence Association, or UDA, but there was also the Ulster Volunteer Force, or UVF. The subjects of this video, the Shankill Butchers, were part of this side of the conflict, and specifically the UVF, apparently fighting to keep Northern Ireland as part of the UK, but this is bullshit as we'll get to. Whilst this was a conflict apparently about territory and the rule of government, it became characterised by sectarian violence, Catholics versus Protestants. This is because the IRA tended to be based in Catholic areas, whilst those from the UDA and UVF often hail from areas considered Protestant. This is an important point, because this conflict evolved into groups and individuals seeing innocent civilians who are likely simply going about their day as being legitimate targets simply because they're in a certain area and may or may not have been one of two strands of the same religion. The Shankill Butchers apparently targeted Catholics, but as we'll get to, this was bollocks. The idea of being able to simply identify a Catholic and a Protestant from looking at them is nonsense. This group simply wanted to kill, and kill again. Patrolling the streets were members of the British Armed Forces, deployed to support the Royal Ulster Constabulary, apparently to bring order back to the streets. However, their presence simply exacerbated the conflict by fueling public anger and mistrust. All sides committed atrocities during the Troubles. The Omagh bombing on the 15th of August 1998, carried out by the real IRA, resulted in the deaths of 29 innocent civilians. On the 4th of December 1971, the UVF exploded a bomb on the Gerry's bar in Belfast. The explosion caused the building to collapse, killing 15 civilians and wounding 17 more. Lastly, on the 30th of January 1972, the British Army shot 26 unarmed civilians during a protest march in the Bogside area of Gerry, in an event known as Bloody Sunday. Out of the approximately 3,500 people who were killed during the Troubles, half were innocent civilians, the very people that all sides were apparently trying to protect, or whose future they were apparently fighting for. This included around 250 children. I'm not going to go into the economics, politics, and social background to this conflict, which has rooted in hundreds of years of history, because I refuse to legitimise the behaviour of either side for two primary reasons, directly linked to the subjects of this video. Firstly, because no matter how noble your underlying cause might be, if you're murdering men, women and children, you're not a freedom fighter, you're not a soldier, you're a killer. A point that seems to escape some people, meaning that the most evil men involved in the Troubles, including the butchers, are considered by a thankfully small proportion of the population to be heroes to this day. The second reason is due to the fact that it's really, really important to understand that in any conflict, any war, there will be some who see it as an opportunity to live out their twisted fantasies of violence. They don't believe in any cause, but we use it as cover, an excuse to kill people, simply because they enjoy it, because they want to feel the rush from ending a human life, from wielding ultimate power. This is why I used the word supposedly before. It's very important to not romanticise the behaviour of these criminals, and not for 1 second believe they were doing this for the benefit of anyone else but themselves. That is who the Shankill butchers were, pathetic but extremely dangerous men who enjoyed killing. There was no cause, they just liked hunting people like animals and taking their lives. They were not heroes, they were not soldiers, they were monsters, with their leader Lenny Murphy being one of the most sadistic and dangerous men I've covered on this channel. Whilst the butchers as a whole are known as the most prolific gang of serial killers in UK history, Murphy, on his own, killed more people than Peter Sutcliffe, more than the Wests, but his name is one many of you have likely never heard of. Hugh Leonard Thompson Murphy, known throughout his life as Lenny, was born on the 2nd of March 1952, the youngest of 3 sons of William and Joyce Murphy, with his older brothers being called William Jr. and John. Joyce was the dominant figure in the household, a woman who hated Catholics and no doubt instilled this in her sons. She was a woman completely disconnected from reality, who, as we'll get to much later, would not hear a negative word against her serial killer son. The family grew up in the Shankill area of West Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland, and throughout the Troubles, this was considered a loyalist stronghold. Murphy was a bully from a young age, and by the time he was 10 years old, he was regularly taking a knife into school, where he would use it to threaten other children and steal their lunch money. Someone who knew Murphy at the time later stated, quote, "He was a tough wee nut, and his brothers were known to be hard men. He would always have threatened you with his brothers if you confronted him on his own. He was devious. I remember him taking my lunch money off me on the way into school one day. I gave it to him because he had a penknife. You just knew not to mess with him." 2 years later, at the age of 12 years old, he had his first brush with the law and was given probation for shoplifting and larceny. Murphy had no interest in his studies, violence and threats of power, and he cut his criminal teeth in school. At Model Secondary School, Murphy continued his pattern of extorting money from his classmates at knife point. He would specifically target children and families who owned newsagents, confectionery or butcher shops, knowing they had more money. In 1968, aged 16, Lenny Murphy left school and continued his criminal endeavours. He started small, being convicted of shoplifting and driving offences, but he was soon trying to make a name for himself. He began to wear flashy clothes, deliberately to be noticed, and was regularly hanging out at pubs, including the Glue Pot, and the Biardo, the latter being known as a drinking spot for some very dangerous men in the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, and he soon joined the junior wing of this paramilitary organisation. Between 1970 and 1971, Lenny Murphy began forming his first gang, and he recruited 2 other violent, reprehensible human beings who would be front and centre to the horrors that were to come. These were Robert Bates and Sam McAllister. Both men terrorised other pupils whilst at Ballygo Martin Secondary School in West Belfast. They, like Murphy, extorted money from those weaker than them, and if they refused to pay, McAllister was known to bash his victim's head into the wash basin. Bates, who was known as Basher, was a big lumbering piece of shit who spoke with his fists. He had a reputation in the Shankill for having beaten people with beer glasses or bottles in pub fights. Bates and McAllister, like Murphy, also joined the UVF. Lenny Murphy was desperate to be noticed, desperate to rise up the ranks of the UVF, and he got involved in any acts of violence he could. And in 1972, aged 20, he was involved in the killing of 2 men, one as part of a group, and during the second, he was the trigger man. On the 21st of July 1972, Lenny Murphy and members of the UVF were looking for revenge. The day before, 2 Protestants had been murdered, and so they were looking to even the scales by killing a Catholic. Any would do. They spotted a taxi, and simply because it was coming from a certain area of Belfast, they identified the person inside was likely Catholic, therefore the enemy, and he deserved to die. Inside was 34-year-old Francis Arthurs, a Catholic man, simply travelling home from the pub. He had no link to any organisation. He was an innocent civilian. The taxi was stopped, and Francis was dragged out and frog-marched into the Longbrooke Social Club and held in the back until regular drinkers left. Francis was then paraded in front of those that remained in the club, all of whom gave him a savage beating. One man was seen to demonstrate that he could cause Francis as much pain as possible by hitting him harder than everyone else. Everyone was cheering and jeering whilst this man was beaten to within an inch of his life. Then Lenny Murphy stepped forward, knife in hand. He spent around half an hour stabbing Francis all over his body, wounds intended to inflict the maximum amount of pain whilst prolonging his suffering. Francis Arthur was tortured for around 6 hours in total, before finally he was shot in the head. His body was then bundled into a car and dumped a mile away. During the summer of 1972, 2 more badly mutilated bodies were found in the same condition in approximately the same location as Francis's remains, both showing signs of Lenny Murphy's knife work, although he was never tied to these killings. The level of torture and sadism is shown by the pattern of wounds on one victim, who had long cuts down his back and thighs and 147 stab wounds across his body. Having shown his propensity for acts of extreme violence, on the 28th of September 1972, Lenny Murphy was sent on a murder mission by the leadership of the UVF. The target was a 32-year-old Protestant man called William Edward Pavis, who was suspected of selling arms to the IRA. Murphy had an accomplice, 20-year-old Mervyn John Connor. They travelled to William's home, apparently to buy guns. William said he didn't have any, and Murphy walked with him, arm around his shoulder to the front door, as though he was going to leave. Without warning, Lenny Murphy pulled out a gun and shot William dead at point-blank range. He then left. Several months later, both Lenny Murphy and Mervyn Connor were picked up by the police and remanded to prison, as they were the last people to be seen with William prior to his murder. Murphy didn't crack, but Mervyn was a different prospect. Detectives visited him in prison and applied pressure, hoping that he would flip. Lenny Murphy got wind of this and had cyanide smuggled in. He laced a vat of custard, intending for Mervyn to eat this. Other prisoners would inevitably have done the same, but Murphy didn't care. If he had to kill 20 others to get to his main target, he was fully willing and more than capable of doing this. This didn't work, but he bided his time. One day, when the guards who were meant to be looking after Mervyn Connor were distracted, or potentially paid off, Murphy marched into his accomplice's cell, grabbed him around the throat, and forced him to write a confession letter, admitting he was the killer. Murphy then pulled out a vial of cyanide, poured it down Mervyn's throat and left. Within minutes, he was dead. the trial for the murder of William Pavis fell apart, and in May 1975, 23-year-old Lenny Murphy walked free from prison and returned to the Shankill. He was a sadist, a killer, a man with an insatiable bloodlust who got straight back to work, forming a new gang who should unleash a reign of terror and unbelievable savagery on the streets of Belfast, which would last 7 years and claim over 20 lives. I've already mentioned 3 of the members of the Shankill Butchers: Lenny Murphy, Robert Bates and Sam McAllister, but there was also William Moore. He was born in 1949 in Belfast and lived with his widowed mother and was seen by neighbours as a quiet, unassuming individual, but others later stated that he was a remorseless, psychopathic bigot who had an obsession with murder and dismemberment. He worked as a meat packer in Woodvale Meats on the Shankill Road and had a morbid fascination with the carcasses of the dead animals and asked someone to teach him how to use a knife to strip flesh from bone. When he left his job, he stole a pair of butcher's knives and a meat cleaver, the weapons which would be used to torture and mutilate the subsequent victims. In 1975, he'd switched jobs to become a taxi driver and had acquired a London black taxi, the vehicle which would be used to trawl the streets looking for victims. William Moore and Lenny Murphy met by chance in a pub. The former knew the latter by reputation and was enamoured by him. Murphy was well known at the pubs in the area, now less so for his flashy dress sense, but more for the fact that he was a ruthless killer who would stand at the bar with a 9mm pistol tucked in his belt. When Moore was asked to join the gang Murphy was forming, he jumped at the chance. These 4 formed the inner circle of the Butchers. As to the others, there are believed to have been at least 20 members of the Butchers, many of whom have never been identified. However, I'll name known individuals as we go along, as well as display their photos if one is available. At the centre of everything was Lenny Murphy's rabid hatred of Catholics, something that had been drilled into him since he was in the cradle. This would dominate his thoughts and conversations. He would spend hours spewing his hatred towards his fellow Irish men and women who simply followed a different religion, appearing to believe that anyone who was Catholic was somehow a traitor and deserved to die. Murphy would deliberately go looking for trouble, always with a couple of goons, and his actions show how much of an unhinged coward he really was. So one example occurred just a few months after Murphy was released from prison in May 1975, when he was at a hamburger bar known as Ken's in Belfast city centre. A man called John Donnelly had the misfortune of finding himself standing next to Murphy, who turned to him and asked what religion he was. As soon as John said he was Catholic, he was set upon and badly beaten by Murphy and his grinning goons. Late-night revellers stepped in and stopped more serious injury being inflicted, and John was able to escape. The lunacy of Lenny Murphy's behaviour is front and centre in Martin Dillon's definitive book on this case. Specifically, it's not even clear why he hated Catholics that much. It seems as though he'd go from liking someone, and as soon as they mentioned being Catholic, he would literally switch and be willing to kill them. This is just classic prejudice, classic knuckle-dragging thinking, believing that everyone in the group shares the same traits, and therefore this one identifying factor is enough to tell them everything about the person. This is what underpins racism, homophobia, etc. You're black, so you must be this and must be that. With Lenny Murphy, being Catholic meant that men, women and children were instantly subhuman and deserved to die. It's fucking ridiculous. However, as we progress through the case, you'll see that Lenny Murphy considered anyone subhuman. Everyone deserved to die, Catholic or Protestant. Initially, some efforts were made to increase the chances of Catholics being their victims. William Moore would drive his taxi during the day, legitimately picking up fares and dropping them at their destinations, whilst also scouting for potential areas to pick up victims, focusing on areas and roads within or linked to predominantly Catholic communities. Of course, these monsters seemed to misunderstand that not everyone was as deranged and bigoted as they were, and that, surprise, surprise, in many areas, Catholics and Protestants mingled quite happily, simply going about their day, just trying to live their lives. These same innocent people had no idea that a reign of terror on the streets of Belfast would soon begin, which would shock a community hardened by years of sectarian violence. The total number of victims of the Shankill butchers is unclear. It's known they ended the lives of at least 22 people, although the true number is likely over 30. I'll mention each and every victim, and I'll show their photos if they're available. I'll begin numbering the victims from 1 to highlight all killings linked to the period where the butchers were active, but don't forget that Lenny Murphy had already killed 2 people by this point. I'll highlight the number of victims he specifically murdered to add to his total, to highlight how, whilst the Shankill butchers are the worst gang of serial killers in UK history collectively, he is one of the most prolific individual serial killers on either side of the Atlantic. The first 4 killings linked to the group occurred on the 2nd of October 1975, where Murphy decided to rob Casey's wholesale wine and spirits establishment in the Millfield area of Belfast. This was a business owned by a Catholic family, so it was fair game in Murphy's mind. 4 men were involved: Lenny Murphy, William Moore, and another man called William Arlo Green. There was also an unidentified driver who drove a stolen van to the business at around 11:30 AM and remained in the vehicle with the engine running for a quick getaway. All 4 were armed with pistols. In the store was 35-year-old Frances Donnelly and her sister, 47-year-old Marie McGrattan, as well as Gerry Grogan and Thomas Osborne, both just 18 years old. To reduce suspicion, Murphy, Moore and Green acted as though they were there to pick up an order of spirits. Marie and her sister Frances suggested they step into an upstairs office to discuss the purchase. Lenny Murphy and William Green went with them, whilst William Moore was downstairs chatting to the 2 18-year-olds. As soon as they were in the office, the mood changed, and Murphy and Green pulled out their pistols and demanded cash. It was explained to them that as it was early in the morning, there was no money, as the trading day had just begun. This set Murphy into a rage, and he began ripping the place apart. Eventually, finding nothing, he demanded the 2 sisters get on their hands and knees. He then executed Marie McGrattan with a gunshot to the head. At the same time, William Green killed Frances Donnelly in the same fashion. The gunshots caused Gerry Grogan and Thomas Osborne to panic, but before they could react, William Moore pulled out a gun. Within seconds, Lenny Murphy was by his side. He then asked what religion the pair were. When they said Catholic, Murphy fired. Gerry Grogan was killed instantly. Thomas Osborne, who was shot in the neck, survived the initial attack, but died in hospital 3 weeks later. On the 22nd of November 1975, 3 British soldiers were killed at an army observation post in County Armagh by members of the Provisional IRA. In response, Lenny Murphy decided that a Catholic needed to die. In his mind, this was not perpetrating the cycle of pointless violence, it was equaling the scales. He would kill a Catholic, any would do. Inevitably, they would have absolutely nothing to do with the deaths of these 3 soldiers or the conflict as a whole. The man who would eventually be chosen was 34-year-old Francis Crossan, who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Francis, a Catholic man, spent the last few hours of his life in Holy Cross Bowling Club in the Ardorning district of Belfast, spending time with friends and having a quiet drink. At 10 minutes past midnight, on the 25th of November 1975, Francis left the club and began his journey home on foot. He was on Library Street when he was spotted by Lenny Murphy, who was in William Moore's taxi, along with men called Ben Edwards and Archie Waller. The group had been trawling the streets for hours looking for a victim. Their rationale was that anyone walking the streets in this area this late at night was likely to be Catholic. Murphy ordered Moore to pull up alongside Francis. The men then rushed out of the taxi and hit him over the head with a wheel brace, stunning him. Before he knew it, he was in the back of the taxi, which was speeding away. Lenny Murphy was later reported to have beaten Francis on the floor of the taxi with his fists and the wheel brace, whilst repeating, quote, "I'm going to kill you, you bastard." The taxi pulled into Wimbledon Street in the Shankill, and Francis was carried out of the vehicle. He was still alive, but had been beaten to a pulp, and the inside of the taxi was splattered with blood. Murphy stood over Francis, who had his eyes closed and was breathing heavily. He took one of the butcher's knives William Moore had stolen from his previous job. He then began hacking at Francis Crossan's throat, eventually cutting it down to the spine, almost decapitating him. He then held the bloody knife aloft, his hands and clothing covered with blood. 6 hours later, an elderly resident in Wimbledon Street came out to look for a cat. She thought she stumbled across a tailor's dummy, but as she got closer, she saw it was the body of a man lying in a pool of blood. A few days later, one of the men involved in the killing of Francis Crossan, Archie got his comeuppance. He was murdered by members of the paramilitary group that all of the butchers belonged to, the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, due to his participation in an unsanctioned murder. Lenny Murphy was furious. He wanted revenge, and he decided, rightly or wrongly, that the trigger man was 19-year-old Noel Shaw, another UVF member. On the 30th of November 1975, Noel was tracked down, abducted, and taken to Lawnbrook Social Club. He was strapped to a chair in front of 20 jeering men and beaten repeatedly. Eventually, Lenny Murphy took out his pistol. Noel instinctively put up his hand. The first shot hit him in the wrist. The next 3 shots entered Noel's skull, and he died instantly. His body was dumped in an alley around a mile away. The final murder of 1975 is interesting, with Murphy killing one of his own, another member of the UVF. In fact, despite their supposed mortal enemies being the Provisional IRA, none of the victims, and I mean none of them, had anything to do with the IRA. They were all innocent civilians, with a few being fellow loyalists. So by the end of 1975, just a few months after the Shankill butchers had been formed, they had killed 6 people. Lenny Murphy had been responsible for ending the lives of 5 of them, bringing the total number of people he personally killed to 7. Just to state, he was only 23 years old at this point. The murder of 25-year-old Edward McQuaid on the 10th of January 1976 began the most bloodthirsty 12 months of the butcher's almost decade-long murder spree. During this year, 8 more people would die. The murder of Edward, known as Ted, shows how indiscriminate these monsters were and how women were also potential targets. In the early hours of the morning, Ted and his wife Deirdre had left a party at a flat in Cliftonville Road, a Catholic area of Belfast, and both were drunk. Ted was stood to one side, urinating against a wall in the street, when a black taxi appeared, drove past slowly, and disappeared out of view. Deirdre later told the police, quote, "It reappeared from a side street opposite where I was standing and turned right before driving down the Cliftonville Road. Ted arrived, and he and I began walking down the Cliftonville Road. The taxi suddenly came up the road again. I told Ted I thought this was strange because the taxi had driven up the Cliftonville Road a short time previously. Suddenly, the taxi drove past us, going in our direction, and I saw it stop a short distance in front of us. I said to Ted about the taxi, but he did not seem to be alarmed. Ted was between the taxi and me. The door opened, and a young man got out and started walking towards us. He was swaying as if he was drunk, and I said to Ted, 'It's okay, he's drunk.' Suddenly, he put his left hand inside his jacket and pulled out a small gun, which he pointed at Ted and started firing. He never looked at me, but kept shooting at Ted. Ted fell to the ground, but he just kept shooting. I threw my handbag at him, but he jumped into the taxi and drove off at speed. I went to Ted, and he said, 'Run, Deirdre.' I started screaming for help and ran back to the flat. The gunman was Lenny Murphy, and behind the wheel of the taxi was William Moore, who had been told to slow down when 2 figures were seen ahead of them. Deirdre was seen first, and he decided she was his target. However, it was only when they got closer they realised she was female. Moore mentioned this, but Murphy coldly responded, quote, 'She will do.' However, his focus then switched to Ted when he was spotted. So Deirdre survived, but she had to watch her husband being gunned down in the street in front of her, making her a widow at the age of just 21 years old. The life of 55-year-old Thomas Quinn came to an end just a month later, on the 6th of February 1976, and his case is truly tragic. He was a road sweeper by trade, whose life had completely fallen apart since the death of his wife 2 years before. He was a lonely, isolated man who drowned his sorrows and would frequently be seen walking aimlessly, drunk through the city centre. Thomas stood at just 5 foot 4 inches tall and could offer no resistance when the black taxi pulled alongside him in the early hours of the morning, and Lenny Murphy jumped out and hit Thomas around the head with a wheel brace, knocking him to the floor. He was then carried into the back of the taxi by Murphy and Robert Bates. William Moore then drove the taxi back to the Lawnbrook Social Club so that the knives could be collected. They were also joined by Ben Edwards. Thomas then began his final journey, with the taxi heading towards the Glencairn estate in the west of the city. Along the way, Lenny Murphy cut Thomas's throat several times, but these were wounds intended to cause bleeding and pain, and not death. Thomas was then carried, semi-conscious, out of the taxi into an alleyway, and here his throat was cut down to the spine, almost decapitating him. This wound was almost definitely inflicted by Murphy. Thomas's body was simply left where it fell, and he was quickly discovered hours later. By this point, Lenny Murphy was bored of killing individual people. He wanted to commit a mass murder, and he'd already begun formulating a plan when he received a tip-off about a truck that transported workers to a timber yard every morning, which travelled through the Shankill. Some of the workers sat in the cab, others on the open area in the rear of the vehicle. The workers were both Catholics and Protestants, but Murphy didn't care. In Martin Dillon's book, it states, quote, "His fanatical hatred frequently obscured his judgment and allowed him to dismiss any petty hindrances which might arise, such as the fact that Protestants might have to die, to enable him to kill a large number of Catholics." Murphy borrowed the gang's taxi and followed the truck for weeks, learning its route and routine, which was predictable. Every weekday morning, the truck would pick up the workers, and at 7:45 a.m. would stop outside a newsagent's known as Adair's Corner at the corner of Cambray Street, where the driver would go in to buy his newspaper, and some of the workers would go in to buy their lunch before continuing on their journey. The date of the attack, the 9th of February 1976, just 3 days after Thomas Quinn's murder, was no different. The truck on that day had 3 in the cab and 4 in the back. In the driver's seat was 51-year-old Archie Hanna, and next to him was 27-year-old Raymond Carlisle, a worker at the timber yard. On the dot, at 7:45 a.m, the truck stopped outside the newsagent's. The stolen Cortina then pulled up near the rear of the van. Behind the wheel was William Moore. The other occupants were Lenny Murphy, armed with a Thompson submachine gun, and Robert Bates, armed with an MK1 carbine. The 2 men strode out of the car, wearing black masks, and began firing. The Thompson jammed after only 5 shots, so the pair switched weapons, and Murphy fired round after round. In total, 18 shots were fired. Archie Hanna and Raymond Carlisle were killed instantly, whilst 2 others were hit, including one who was shot in the head, but survived. The killers then fled. It appears that the bullets fired by Murphy were the ones that killed both men, who were, in fact, Protestant, not Catholic. The next murder showed how brazen these killers were. They didn't give a fuck who saw them. In fact, the torture and mutilation of random civilians was a form of entertainment. On the 26th of February 1976, Lenny Murphy was holding court at a bar in Belfast, lecturing his cronies about the fact that the only way to create political change was to create terror amongst the enemy. Those hanging on his every word included Robert Bates, William Moore, and another man known only as Mr. C, as he was never convicted of any crimes and his identity subsequently protected. Murphy then invited 2 women to join them and continued his lecture. At 1 a.m. on the 27th of February, the 4 men and 2 women left and all got into Moore's taxi. The women joined because the plan was to go across town and buy chips. As they were driving, Murphy spotted 24-year-old Francis Rice, who had been drinking at a Catholic social club and was on his way home. The taxi drove alongside him, and he too was hit across the back of the head with a wheel brace and dragged into the vehicle. In front of the 2 stunned women, Francis was beaten and tortured with a knife by Lenny Murphy. He was then dragged down an alleyway off Esmond Street by Murphy, Bates and Mr. C, where he was kicked before Murphy got to work with his knife. It took several minutes to hack through Francis's neck until the knife touched his spine. They then returned to the taxi, and the women were dropped off before the vehicle was cleaned of blood. Both women would later tell detectives what they'd seen. One of them relocated to Canada in order to get away from the horrors she'd witnessed on what was meant to be a fun night out. Lenny Murphy's bloodlust was insatiable. He believed he was invincible, and luckily for everyone else, he would make a mistake which would temporarily take this violent psychopath off the streets. In the early hours of the 2nd of March 1976, just 3 days after the murder of Francis Rice, Lenny Murphy attempted to kill 2 young Catholic women, 25-year-old Mary Murray and 28-year-old Margaret McCartney. They were travelling in a car along the Cliftonville Road. Suddenly, a car pulled up behind them and began flashing its lights on and off, a method used by police in armoured patrols to signal cars to stop. Mary, who was behind the wheel, slowed down when suddenly the car pulled alongside. Murphy levelled a gun at the women and pulled the trigger at least 5 times. Mary was hit by 3 bullets, 1 in the right shoulder and 2 in her lower chest area. Bullets narrowly missed Margaret's head. Mary was seriously injured, but ultimately survived. The shots were heard by a mobile army patrol, who quickly set up a checkpoint, and the men drove straight towards it. The car didn't stop, and 2 shots were fired by the soldiers, which hit the vehicle, but not the occupants, who sped away. What Murphy didn't seem to realise was that approximately an hour and a half before the shooting, the vehicle had been seen by a separate army unit, and he had been recognised. Soldiers from the British Army and officers from the Royal Ulster Constabulary were soon on the scene, began searching for the perpetrators. All they found initially was the burnt-out car involved in the shooting. However, Murphy had been seen, and around 3 hours later, he was found in a car that was pulled over by another army unit. He was arrested and handed over to the police. Gunshot residue was detected on his clothing, but detectives didn't have enough to charge him, and he was released, but they set up Lenny Murphy to make the case for them. The gun used had been found in some hedges, and after being tested, was found to be the weapon used in the shooting. Police played a hunch that the gun had been deliberately hidden, not discarded, and the owner was likely to come back for it. Officers were stationed out of sight, watching the area, and soon after his release from custody, on the 3rd of March 1976, the day after the shooting, Lenny Murphy was seen searching through the hedge, looking for the gun. He was promptly arrested. This time, there was enough evidence to charge Lenny Murphy with attempted murder, and he was remanded. Eventually, almost 17 months later, on the 11th of October 1977, Murphy was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Whilst he'd only been incarcerated for attempted murder, the reality was that Lenny Murphy had in fact killed 12 people by this point. This was not the end of his killing spree, but it was put on hold. But this didn't mean the Shankill butchers would stop. Command moved to William Moore, who eagerly stepped up. Murphy was regularly visited by members of the gang, and he gave his orders from prison to carry out more cutthroat murders, to not show loyalty to the cause, but to show devotion to him personally. His fellow psychopaths eagerly complied, and 12 more people would die, including a 10-year-old child.